these aerial dogfights where you had this great, slow, lumbering bomber versus these very fast and dangerous fighters, it meant that the bomber pilots, these 21-year-old pilots like Laurie, had to aim their aircraft at mad German fighter pilots and the flak shells would explode at 20,000 feet, and if you were anywhere near them, they could knock you out of the sky, and the result, usually, was death. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. Today we're going to have a bit of a departure from our normal bill of fare. This week we celebrate Anzac Day. Every year I try to find a story that tells us something about what Anzac means to most Australians. And amazingly enough, most times you find one that's different from all the others and yet somehow linked. This year I had the privilege of going out to the northern suburbs of Melbourne and meeting a wonderful old man called Laurie Larmer. Laurie Larmer is 98 years old. He was born in 1923. That is a decade before my parents were born, which puts him in context. He is old enough to be, if not a great-grandfather, perhaps even a great-great-grandfather. And yet this old man, who looks fairly frail, is as bright as a button. His eyes shine and gleam with mischief. He cracks jokes that are funny. His memory of what happened when he went to war are as sharp as if it happened last year, not 76 years ago. One of the amazing things about the story of Laurie Larmer is this, that it wasn't until I met him that I realised that the last bombing mission that he flew over Germany in 1945 was actually on April the 25th. And so this Anzac Day is precisely the 76th anniversary of Laurie Larmer's last raid over Germany. Laurie was only 21 when he piloted a huge Halifax bomber with 6 other crew members in it, a navigator, wireless operator, gunners, technicians. There were 6 others, and yet he was chosen to be pilot, despite the fact that he was the youngest of all of them. He was just 21. The oldest guy in the crew was 25. That tells us something about just how young these young men were who came from across the world, from Australia, from Canada, from South Africa and other places, to fight the war against the Nazis. Laurie is and was a Melbourne boy. His father had been a house painter who got lucky. He inherited a pub in Punt Road near the corner of Toorak Road, and he ran that pub for some years until it was sold under the terms of his uncle's will, and then he moved to another pub and then another one, and young Laurie went along for the ride in the family pubs. He grew up mostly around Ballarat, but they returned to Melbourne around the time that Laurie finished school. Unlike a lot of Depression-era children, Laurie Larmer actually went to school right through to 6th form, as they used to call it, year 12, and he matriculated. That means he passed his exams well enough that he would be able to go to university, which in those days was very rare and very unusual. And it probably indicates the level of intelligence and perseverance that he had behind that exterior, which was of just a young lad. He was 18 when he joined up. He'd just finished school. He's a small guy. He was the smallest guy in his crew, ultimately. When he joined up, you could go into the army or you could make a choice about going to the Navy or the Air Force. And he said, I didn't like guns, so I didn't want to go to the army. And so I decided to go to the Air Force and try to become air crew, which of course was the glamour position in those days, to be a pilot or at least to fly against the enemy. His first brush with aircraft was he was sent to Benalla, where he learnt the very basics of flying in Tiger Moth biplanes. These were the old biplanes that were used between the wars. They were little, light, slow aircraft, ideal for people to learn to fly, and yet so very different from the aircraft they would have to fly over occupied Europe. From Benalla and the Tiger Moth, this boy who's still just turning 19 at around this stage is sent over to Canada. There he joins other aspiring pilots and aircrew from around the British Commonwealth nations, the old empire as it was called. They trained in basic training aircraft, Cessnas and the like, and learnt the fine points of landing and takeoff under all conditions. Still, you'd have to realise that they were very raw, inexperienced, and just doing it the best way they could. And while they're learning, their instructors are looking at them and working out which ones would probably make good battle pilots, which ones would make good navigators, which ones would make wireless operators, and so on. Each of them would capitalise on their apparent skill set. Then they're shipped across the extremely dangerous North Atlantic to get to Great Britain. There are German warships, there are U-boats, but Laurie and all his fellow pilots and other Allied military people were loaded on a ship called the Aquitania, and they were sent so far north that they went almost via Greenland to get to Great Britain safely. And they docked at Liverpool, where they were taken off and sent down to Brighton, where all the Australians were put up together in a couple of hotels. From Brighton they went to Lichfield, and from Lichfield, finally, they were sent to Snaith in Yorkshire in early 1945 as part of 51 Bomber Squadron. It turns out that Laurie Larmer and his half-dozen Australian mates were the only Australians to serve in 51 Bomber Squadron. We might as well mention their names. These were all brave men, brave young men, brave boys, really. There was Bill Hudson, he was a bomb aimer. Lance Myers, the 25-year-old who was the old man of the crew. Ron Harmey, the navigator who shared a birthday with Laurie Larmer, but he was a year older. Laurie himself was the pilot. George Bedell, mid-upper gunner. Alan Littleton, flight engineer, who was actually an Englishman. And Joe Helm, the rear gunner, the job that everyone feared and no one wanted. The rear gunner in a bomber was extremely exposed, and if a bomber went down, they had very little chance of getting out with the parachute. 51 Squadron, like many others, had many casualties. During an attack on Nuremberg back in March 1944, that is the previous year, the squadron lost 8 Halifax aircraft in one night, almost the entire strength of the squadron. And so Laurie and his mates faced the reality of going into battle with no experience and knowing that the odds of coming back were usually against them. When they got to Snaith, there was no welcome, no guided tour, no briefing. No one put their arm around your shoulder and said, "Welcome to Snaith, this is what you've got to do, this is what we expect." Words of encouragement. There were none. They were ignored by the rest of the squadron. They just had to bunk down where they were put and get on with it. When I sat down with Laurie Larmer just yesterday, that is during the week before Anzac Day, I sat with him in his house in Strathmore all afternoon, and he told me what it was like to be him in those tense days in early 1945. It was quite riveting to hear someone whose memories are so sharp, whose humour is so good, and yet who is so human and humane that he could look back on what they had to do and to look back at the danger they went through to do it, and to sum it up so well. Laurie and his mates, their first mission was in March 1945. He described to me what it was like. He said we would have a big breakfast of bacon and eggs because you couldn't really eat in the plane, so it was important to have a big, hot, greasy feed to keep you going. And so they'd do that. He said, we go over and get our aircraft gear on, the different stuff you wear in the aircraft, which were sort of leather helmets and the sort of jackets that would keep them warm at the high altitudes. They'd also have to sign out a Mae West life preserver, like a big, ugly life jacket, and sign out parachutes, which he found quite humorous. And he said the standard joke was from the women whose job it was to hand them the parachutes, if it doesn't work, bring it back and we'll give you another one. Everybody had a nervous laugh, and off they went to get into the car or the truck to drive out onto the airfield where the line of enormous Halifax bombers waited for the air crew. And there they would wait nervously while each crew warmed up the motors on their bomber, taxied out onto the airfield and took off into the unknown, really. I said, what was that like, Laurie? He said, well, there was no one there to put their arm around your shoulder and say, it'll be okay, son. There were no comforting words. All we could do, the smokers smoked. Laurie didn't, which is why he's 98, hasn't died. The smokers smoked, and he said we all had a nervous pee, and then we got in the aircraft. We warmed the motors up to the operating temperature, taxied out, and we took off. We flew south from Yorkshire to Reading, and there we massed in the skies above Reading, and then we headed across the Channel, zigzagging across the Channel to make it harder for the Germans to know where we were headed. Some of us were briefed to do diversionary flights towards a different target from the actual target. But he said our actual target on this day was the city of Dortmund in Germany. And ultimately we all got there. We were under strict instructions to fly straight and level at 20,000 feet. No deviations. He said we had to do that because the bombs were set up for the bomb aimer to drop them at 20,000 feet. And the aiming apparatus meant that you had to be at this particular altitude. He said the trouble with that was the anti-aircraft gunners below in Germany knew exactly how to set their guns to shoot you down at 20,000 feet. And so they'd be shooting up shells of what is called flak. And the flak shells would explode at 20,000 feet. And if you were anywhere near them, they could knock you out of the sky. And the result, usually, was death, unless you were lucky enough to drag your parachute on and eject from the burning plane and float down into an uncertain future in occupied Europe, which by 1945 was a very uncertain future indeed. Laurie said not all pilots had the nerve to hold the altitude. He said some of them instinctively wanted to save themselves and they would go higher. They'd climb in their planes to get away from the flak. He said the trouble with that was, for those below, it was sometimes a death sentence because as the one up high dropped their bomb load, it could hit their own planes below them. So it was very dangerous. He said the other thing that people sometimes don't realise is that the authorities, the military hierarchy, had fitted all the bombers with automatic cameras that took photographs of the target city continually to show that they'd actually dropped their bomb load over the target and not somewhere else. And they had to do this because earlier in the war, terrified bombing crews would say, let's just drop this load over the countryside somewhere and then fly home. And they wouldn't actually go to the target where they would be shot at. And so they fitted the cameras to stop people doing this. Laurie said he managed to hold his craft at 20,000 feet and to fly level and true after dropping the bomb load so that the camera could record what had happened below them. And then they would turn around and fly back to Yorkshire, to Snaith. I said, Laurie, what would happen if you got away from the flak but the German fighter planes caught up with you? He said, well, we were slow. We could only do about 150 miles an hour loaded and maybe 160 empty. He said the Messerschmitts and the fighter planes could do double that speed at least. And he said what we would do was aim straight at them. If they were coming for us, we would aim straight at them so that they wouldn't have time to aim their machine guns at us before they collided with us. And so we would force them to play chicken and go above us or below us to get away from us. And because they were going so fast, they would take quite a while to turn their aircraft and come back to have another go at us. And so these aerial dogfights where you had this great, slow, lumbering bomber versus these very fast and dangerous fighters, it meant that the bomber pilots, these 21-year-old pilots like Laurie, had to aim their aircraft at mad German fighter pilots and hope that the fighter pilots would pull out. And that's how they got through. But there was no guarantee that you would get through. And of course, every day that there were raids, someone wouldn't come home. Laurie and his friends had arrived for the last phase of the war. Not that anyone knew it really was the last phase. Each day it was the same as it had been earlier. They had to go up, they had to bomb Germany, anti-aircraft guns shot at them, the fighters shot at them. It really was nearly as dangerous as it had ever been. Amazingly, the first 4 missions that Laurie's crew flew were in consecutive days. And then he flew another 5 missions inside the next month. And so in just 44 days, between early March and Anzac Day, the 25th of April, he flew 9 missions over occupied Europe. On each occasion, they could have been blown out of the sky. The danger wasn't even over when you got back over English skies, because these were very dangerous craft to fly. People made mistakes. The aircraft weren't perfect. Sometimes there were mechanical faults. Sometimes there were navigation errors. Sometimes, the fuel might have had water in it. Who knows what could go wrong, and sometimes did go wrong. Laurie landed from one of his missions and he realised that one of the other crews had overshot the airstrip and crashed their plane at the end of the strip, and all 7 men were killed. He was shocked and distressed to see this. It happened right in front of him. And when he disembarked and went back to the mess, he said to an English officer, "So when's the funerals for our colleagues who were killed?" And the man just said, "There's a war on, son. There won't be military funerals for them." So no minute silence, no flag at half-mast, no signs of military respect. They were just buried in the nearest churchyard, like any civilian was, not like the young heroes that they actually were. And he said to me, this was one of the examples of the callousness of war. That was his phrase. He said it was terrible that people could be killed and so little notice was taken of them. And no one seemed to care because no one could afford to care. And this struck him and I think wounded him deeply. On one mission, he told me, he saw what happened when people broke formation and bombers went higher than they were supposed to or others went lower. He actually saw 2 planes collide because one that was climbing didn't realise that there was one above it and just climbed straight up and hit the other one, because the one thing a pilot cannot see is directly above themselves. And he said he saw this happen. And he said there's 2 planes, that's 14 airmen, and he said I only saw 5 parachutes. All the rest were killed instantly or couldn't get out and died when the wreckage hit the ground. Only 5 parachutes from those 2 aircrew, all because of a mistake about altitude. One of the attacks he did was on the city of Hamburg to break up German troops. But as he found out later, it also killed about 200 civilians in underground shelters. Later on, they had to bomb the city of Beirut, which, as he points out, was where Wagner was from. And so Laurie realised that because of the war, he and his mates were having to bomb where there were German civilians, regardless of the loss of life, and also to burn down medieval towns and cities that were part of the culture of Europe that is shared by the world. And so, after 44 days of extremely active service, Laurie Larmer and his crew of Australians survived. They were moved out of Snaith in Yorkshire back to Brighton and then eventually shipped home to Australia, where he disembarked in Sydney and took a train back to Melbourne. And there he went to a big ceremony at the exhibition buildings where he was reunited with his family. And he remembers that very fondly, to be home safe at last. And so, of course, the question is, what happened next? And we'll be back after this. And what happened next for a lot of these guys wasn't good. Laurie Larmer was a success story. He survived the war, but he also survived the trauma of surviving the war better than many. But he did have a few rough times. He said he enrolled in law at Melbourne University, and he said it was a great waste of time. He couldn't concentrate. He didn't care. He said he just wasted a year pretending to do law at Melbourne Uni. And then he walked out of the law course, said bugger that. Then he joined the Shell Company. He had an office job in the city. He was just another man in a suit and tie and a hat and shiny shoes. And he went off to work and it was okay. But then he moved over and joined what was called the Roots Group. The Roots Group were the car importers who brought in English cars such as Hillmans and Humbers and those sort of vehicles from the mother country, from England. He helped run that company's Victorian sales department. But in 1978, he went back to the thing that his family knew best. He went back into pubs. And Laurie Larmer, in early middle age, took over the Dutagala Hotel in Racecourse Road, Flemington, or Newmarket, right near the railway line, where generations of Melburnians have driven past or maybe had a drink on their way to Flemington Racecourse, which is only about 400 or 500 metres away. And he ran that pub for 20 years and had many adventures there with the clientele. It was a rough, tough pub. The local police would not go in there unless there were 4 of them. It was frequented by armed robbers, among others. And Laurie didn't find it a problem at all. He said that after flying over Germany, being shot at by experts, a few armed robbers in Flemington were just light relief. Laurie Larmer lived a good life. He married Pauline in 1949 on the way through. He had children. He prospered in corporate life and then in business in his pubs. He's ended up being a man who races several racehorses. He still does at the age of 98. He takes a great interest in racing. In fact, while I was interviewing Laurie, he took a phone call from Terry Henderson, one of Australia's biggest syndicators of the sort of horses that win Melbourne Cups and Sydney Cups. And Laurie, at 98, still thinks he's got a chance to come up with a Melbourne Cup horse. But he's an intelligent man, and he can't help thinking about what happened and what didn't happen back in that crowded year between 1944 and 1945. And he knows that during the war, the RAF Bomber Command lost nearly 50,000 people, killed in action or died in prisoner of war camps. Another 8,000 died in accidents, just like those 7 or 8 that he saw killed at Snaith. More than 3,000 Australians who served in RAF Bomber Command died during attacks. So Laurie counted his blessings, but he also thought about what happened in Germany. He couldn't forget that the bombs they let go didn't just kill German soldiers or burn German tanks. They burnt down entire towns, entire cities, destroyed 70-80% of some of these places, and it killed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of civilians. And Laurie knew that some of the raids that he went on had done exactly that. And so in his 90s, just a few years ago, he wrote a letter where he basically said, I don't apologise for flying bombing raids over Germany. It was a war, and it was a just war. but I do apologise to anybody in your town or your city if we killed civilians accidentally. And he wanted his letter to go to the towns and cities that he'd bombed. And he knew where they were and what they were because he had them in his logbook. He'd never forget the names. And he took his letter into the consul in the city of Melbourne, the German consul, who looked at it and said, look, this should really go to the ambassador in the embassy in Canberra. And so the consul sent it to the ambassador, who was hugely impressed with this letter. And he didn't just put it in a filing cabinet. He ensured that copies of that letter were sent to the mayor of each of the cities and towns that Laurie Larmer and his crew had bombed. And that was Dortmund, Wuppertal, Homburg, Hagen, Travemünde, Bayreuth, Boisenberg, an island called Heligoland, where there was a German naval base. And finally, on that Anzac Day, 76 years ago, Wangerooge. His letters hit a soft spot in Germany. Many of these cities wrote back. The mayor of Boisenberg wrote a letter which has been reprinted in a booklet which I have in my hand. And in that letter the mayor says, "You did right in bombing the German cities. It is not your guilt that civilians died during your attacks. The commanders of the German forces recruited children at the end of the war to stop the Allied advance. They sent them to their death, knowing they didn't have any chance to win and survive. This is a big disgrace, and not your fight against dictatorship with the target of subduing Europe and the world. I have to thank you for your fight, and I am very sad that the world has not really learned from the cruel time of World War II. We hope to hear of you again. Yours sincerely." And then he signed his name, Herald Jaschke, the mayor of the city of Boisenberg. And so Laurie Larmer, after 95 years, had gone full circle. The other thing that he's proud of, and rightly so, that the French authorities got in touch with him and a few other surviving Allied airmen just in recent years, with these old men almost all gone, just a few left in their 90s, and they awarded Laurie and the others the great honour, the Legion of Honour, which is a decoration normally only given to France's greatest heroes. There's a couple more things to say about Laurie Larmer. I spoke to him 24 hours ago, and just an hour ago before we did this podcast, my telephone goes and it's Laurie Larmer. He wanted to add something. He wanted to add that at a dinner not many years ago, he was sitting next to a rather elegant and distinguished woman who asked him about himself, and he eventually told her that about his war service and so on. And she said, "What did you do?" And he said, "I flew bombers over Germany in 1945. And she suddenly burst into tears and threw her arms around him. And she said, "You saved my parents." And he said, "How did I do that?" She said, "They were in concentration camps. And if you hadn't kept bombing in 1945, they would have died in the concentration camps. But the bombing raids forced the surrender and saved their lives." But when it's all said and done, Laurie Larmer, underneath it all, is a practical, knockabout Aussie, a remarkable man, a hero in his own way, a father, a grandfather, a publican, a bomber pilot, and just a good bloke. Let's hope he wins a Melbourne Cup before he leaves us. I'd just like to say he's not one to hold a grudge. He really does like the Germans these days, because parked in his driveway is a crackerjack Mercedes-Benz. Thanks for listening. Please comment or rate it on whatever platform you're using. And if you haven't done it already, please subscribe.